Well, hi again, this is Stowe Campbell with the Biblical Studies program for the Navigators. And in this Biblical Studies short, we're going to be looking at our current reality, a brief overview of the philosophy of Western civilization and its impact on our present time, specifically with respect to postmodernism. Now, the reality is, before we start this talk, you have to understand that everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a lens by which they see the world. And it helps them as they see, interact with, hear the world. It is what shapes your thinking. Everybody has a worldview, regardless of who they are, their level of education, where they live, male or female, you name it. Everybody has one. And there are many different worldviews, ones on which we could discuss. But I'm going to first just start off briefly with modernism. Now, modernism, in short, comes after the Enlightenment in the 17th century, and as it begins to grow, one of the modern manifestations of it was deism. Some of you who are students of American history might recognize that many of the founding fathers of the United States, such as Thomas Jefferson and Paine and others, were deists. And within that, a deist, let me just give you a few ideas of what a deist believes. A deist believes that there is a God, but that God is distant. He's separated from the world. God has created the world like a watch, and He has wound it up, and then He has left it and walked away. He's created the machine and then gone. Humanity is a creation of God, but He doesn't really care about us. He's distant from us. And so it's the idea of kind of an absentee landlord. And so within that too, because God is distant, miracles don't happen. For example, you can go and pick up a Jeffersonian Bible. They still exist. Thomas Jefferson went through and cut the miracles out of the Bible, because from his view as a deist, miracles can't happen. Why? Because everything is cause and effect. In other words, let's use the example. The effect is that the river turned to blood in Exodus. The cause, because again, God isn't working in space, time, and history, the cause has to be somehow natural. In other words, maybe it was an algae bloom or something like this that causes the Nile to go red. And so it's within this, again, as you look, it's all the explanations are natural. All things must be explained through things that can happen within our current world without any supernatural or any intervention from God. And so revelation, too, as a result, begins to shift out of the picture, because reason now is more important. God isn't communicating with human beings. And so we are left with the empirical method, using our five senses, to discern what is right, what is wrong, to discern truth, to examine this cause and effect universe. And so we could talk more about deism, but deism, again, was very prevalent in the founding of the United States and subsequently afterwards. And that seemed to be a prevalent view of thinking at the time. But then as things begin to move, we kind of move into our next view, which is naturalism. So when Charles Darwin releases his On the Origin of the Species, it radically changes things. And we could go into all types of deals, the way it shifted thinking in multiple disciplines, not just in the area of science. And one of the things is that it eliminated the need for the creator. Some have said it cut the umbilical cord. And so now we've gotten rid of God. We don't need Him anymore. And it replaced God then with the idea of time and chance. That we are here as a result of time and chance. We are not here as a result of a creator. So there's no more divine plan that is going to explain life. And so we are now essentially cosmic orphans. We're the result of a long amount of time. Richard Dawkins put it bluntly, that we're just nothing more than pond scum ultimately. Naturalism further develops the idea and emphasizes the idea of cause and effect. So again, all things must be explained naturally. Science as we know it, that's what the focus is on, is how did we get this cause? We see the effect. Now, what is the cause that brought this about? And so within this, and there's more, of course, that could be said about this, but humans begin to lose their dignity in the Christian sense, because we're no longer made in the image of God. We're now just the result of long evolutionary processes. And as again I stated earlier with Dawkins, we're essentially pond scum. And so we all share our ancestry with all creatures and bacteria. We're no different than anything else. And so naturalism begins to win the day in the 1850s and beyond. And as it grows, we see that it also says that the world can be known and understood as well, but through the lens of reason. So they don't give up on that. And that's very important because modernism ultimately believes that things can be known and understood. Using the empirical method, using reason, we can understand things. But the reality within that is that humans can overestimate what they can understand. And there is hope that science will deliver us from our ills. This is, again, things begin to look very positive. There's hope in the future of discovery and the results it'll bring. Technology will save us. We'll be able to beat back death. Our understanding of the world will unlock all kinds of possibilities. And the key point within this is that things can be known and understood. In other words, truth exists, and not only that, science will discover it. The empirical method will find it out. And this is great, and it rolls for really well, but there's one key event that just dashes this to pieces, and it's the First World War. And all the optimism is gone at that point because of the mass amount of death, the mass amount of destruction that goes on. I mean, even to give you an idea, but there was so much artillery shot in World War I. There are, as a group of people, I think there's at least 6 of them, upwards to 10 of them, whose full-time job is to find these farmers as they're tilling fields in Western Europe, continue to find unexploded ordnance or unexploded shells, and these people have to disarm them. That's how much destruction there was. And it's out of this that the idea of postmodernity begins to emerge, because there is no more hope in the future. Things are not getting better. In fact, with the invention and the mass amounts of destruction we saw in the First World War and into the Second, in fact, things are only getting worse. Now, postmodernism finds its roots in Nietzsche. And Nietzsche comes up with a philosophy called nihilism. And within that, nihilism itself affirms that everything has evolved through randomness and chance. So it's going to look at the natural view of the world and say, yes, that's exactly what happened. And within that, it's going to emphasize the idea of survival of the fittest. So Nietzsche seized on that. We're all evolved, we're cosmic orphans, this is where we sit, but it's all about survival of the fittest. And this is where Nietzsche is, and I'm going to talk about it, power is going to be the lens by which Nietzsche reads everything, which I'll get to in just a minute. But nihilism itself denies that truth exists, or for that matter, anything can exist. It says, guess what? There is no truth. There is no anything. There is nothing. There is no meaning. Everything is meaningless. James Sire, in his book, The Universe Next Door, states that nihilism is not a philosophy at all. It's a denial of philosophy. And so it's within this that Nietzsche begins to develop this, and he looks at the lens again of oppressed and oppressor. And so truth or meaning exists not because it's true, but because it's more powerful than competing truths. Like, for example, the Christianity many of us hold today, or the people believe today, isn't here because it's true. It's here because it's craftier, it was maybe better politically connected, it was savvier, it maybe got some fortunate breaks here and there, and it's because of those reasons that it's true. It's not because it actually is. Or this particular view of the world, yeah, people see that as true. Well, this is because these people have established that, and through their power and their coercion and those things, and that's because of that, things are true. If you are a nihilist, you look everything through the lens of oppressor and oppressed. That is the way in which you look in the world, and I'm going to continue to develop that as this talk goes on. And it's out of that, though, that the reality is that nihilism is quite bleak. And as you look at this, if there is no truth, if there is no meaning, and you and I are just cosmic orphans, and we're left here to determine our own purpose, our own meaning, our own significance, you name it, then that's a lot of pressure on a person. That can cause one to go insane. I mean, how does no one up? What is down? How does one know anything at all? And it's what led Nietzsche to die insane. It's the kind of stuff that pushes people to insanity. One can't remain a nihilist too long because it's too cold. And so it's out of that that a group called existentialists began to emerge. You might know some of them, such as Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus. and others. But existentialists are the response to nihilism because what they say is that nihilism is too dark and it's too cold and it can't be lived out in a healthy manner. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to affirm what nihilism says. We're going to say that there is no meaning, there is no way to discern what is truth. But we've got to find a way to live within nihilism's truth claims. And so as a result, the existentialist recognizes that things are meaningless. But now I have to create meaning so that I can make it through life. Because I don't want to die insane. I don't want to live in the coldness of nihilism. I've got to create my own meaning, my own purpose, my own significance, my own truth that I realize is foolish, that I realize is all a construct, that I realize is all something that I have created because I'm rebelling against the universe. I'm rebelling against that and I'm saying, I'm going to make a social construct, which we'll get into. I'm going to make a personal construct that's going to help me make it through life. And I am completely and totally free to do this. Well, Sire also states about existentialism that within existentialism, the good action is the consciously chosen action. So the good is whatever a person chooses. The good is part of subjectivity. It is not measured by a standard outside the human individual. Each person is the arbitrator of their own truth. Each person decides what they want to be, where they want to go, what they want to do. Existentialists are like Popeye, and that's why you see this photo here, this cartoon of Popeye. What is Popeye's famous phrase? I am who I am, and that's all that I am. So he's a quasi-existentialist. You know, this is who I am. I determine who I am. And this, by the way, a lot of people have heard the term existentialism. It's something I'll do at times. I go, how many of you ever heard the word existentialism? You know, a fair amount of hands will go up and go, how many do you think you can define it? Barely any hands go up. And understandable, you know, but see, here's the thing. When you begin to understand these things that I'm about to talk about, you realize this is the air we breathe. Or if we're fish, this is the water we swim in. It is all around us. So many people are existentialists, and yet they have no idea. So, nihilism and existentialism are postmodern. And what are the realities of postmodernity? Well, the reality is that in postmodernity, every system is a social construct resulting from power and exploitation. Remember, Nietzsche read everything through the grid of oppressor and oppressed. And so whatever we come across, it's a social construct. There is no ultimate standard of right and wrong, and so truth is a social construct. It can be both personal and social. So marriage, for example, how people look at marriage is a social construct. It's something society has created and said, okay, man and a woman, for example, marriage between a man and a woman, that's a social construct, and these are the reasons why it was done. But marriage is not meant to be between a man and a woman. Marriage can be whatever you want it to be. Everything becomes a social construct. And so therefore, everything is a power play. And so truth doesn't exist because it's right, but because it's more powerful or crafty. And so as I mentioned previously with Christianity, but you see this in the area of right now in Western civilization. What are people talking about? Sex, gender roles, whatever those might be. These are all social constructs. There is no male, there is no female. These are just things that society has constructed. And this is how we got to that point, because we're reading things through an existential grid. This hyper-individualist, where the individual determines who they are. Because, and this is looking at things, again, if I am a cosmic orphan that's here as a result of time and chance, then there is no North Star, no meta-narrative that I can construct my life around, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. Now, I know it's kind of probably getting a little obnoxious at this point, but I think it's important to emphasize that everything, and again, it's like I just keep underlining it for you, everything in postmodernity is about power. Because power becomes the explanation for why things are the way they are. And this is why there's such an emphasis on privilege in this current age. Now look, are there some people that are more privileged than others? Absolutely. Privilege exists because there are differences between people. And the differences are not fair at times. By the way, I'm not justifying privilege here. Privilege is part of life. There are differences. But there are also multiple reasons why there is privilege. And there's also multiple reasons why there are differences between people and why there are different results. But the postmodernist looks and says it has one grid to read things through. It's power alone. Why do we have these inequalities over here? It's power. Why is it that we have this over here between different cultures? It's power. Everything can be explained in a postmodern mind through power. Why is it that Christianity is the way it is today? Oh, it's power. That's why. And so that's important for us to understand. When in doubt in postmodernity, go back to power and see what the power plays that are at work. And as a result of this, postmoderns, because they believe everything is a power play, they begin to reject things. So postmodernity, and this is the hard thing, by the way, I should have said this at the beginning. Postmodernity is like trying to understand it's like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. It just constantly defies definition. So even as you listen to me today, there are going to be people watching this and go, that's not postmodern at all. And you know what? They're probably right in a way. Because this is the thing, postmodernism by definition resists definition. It doesn't want to be discovered. It shifts depending on the individual. But there are consistent themes we can see within that. And one of those is the power plays. And within this are these next things that we're going to see. Because a lot of times postmodernity doesn't define itself by what it is. It actually does more by defining itself by what it isn't. So to begin with, postmodernists they criticize and reject the notion of objective reality. There is no objective reality. Why? Because those are just the results of power. If someone says, no, this is the way things are, well, that's the way your tribe or your group or your culture says it is. Okay? But my culture, my tribe, or my person says differently. They also reject an attitude of skepticism, irony towards, and rejection of grand narratives. I cannot emphasize this enough. There is no grand story. There is no umbrella that connects all people. So if we've got all these different groups, there's nothing that pulls them all together. By the way, as Christians, we believe that all humanity is made in the image of God. And so that binds all humanity together. That's a meta-narrative. Postmodernists reject that. They say that doesn't exist. And so why? Because meta-narratives are just another use of power. And why are they just another use of power? Because someone, somewhere, or some group have come up with these meta-narratives to control people and oppress people and get what they want out of them. Again, everything's read through the lens of power. But the problem with this is that these are the kind of narratives that actually hold people together instead of pulling them apart. We need grand meta-narratives. They unite us and orient us as individuals. We need these great stories. By the way, you see this play out in our culture. So for example, people talk about that right now in 2019. There you go, I just dated the talk. In 2019, that we have been in for years now in the golden age of television. And you see all these, we got Mad Men. Now I'm going to date some things. Okay, there's Mad Men. Oh, there was Breaking Bad. Oh, we got The Walking Dead. And, there Game of Thrones wrapped up and all this kind of stuff. But there's no culture. There's no show that everyone watches anymore. Everyone has their own, you watch this. There's so many choices that there's not possible for a large amount of people to see one show. For those who grew up into the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s, it was very common in days past for like NBC, Thursday night, must-see TV. You had various shows, whether it was Cheers, The Cosby Show, Seinfeld, Friends, okay? And these are shows that, quote unquote, and already when I'm going to say this is going to make some of you mad, that everyone watched. The postmodern, not everyone watched that. Okay, yeah, not everyone. But a large percentage of America watched these shows. And so it gave a cultural narrative. I mean, we won't even go into Bill Cosby and all his problems, but how many people watch The Cosby Show across all different types of social strata and different backgrounds, different parts of the country? Tons. Or maybe you were a child of the 80s into the 90s like me. And Friday night, what'd you watch? TGIF. And so you saw Full House or Family Matters or these kind of shows. And that was the thing that you and your friends, you just kind of knew everyone saw these shows. But now it doesn't exist. When Game of Thrones wrapped up earlier this year, there were a couple critics that said, well, folks, I think this might be the last show that everyone watched. Now, we know not everyone watched it, but a large portion of the population, not just in the United States, but across the world, saw it. I'm not justifying the show, but I'm saying these are the kind of, it's like a meta-narrative. But instead we're tribal, and we really see this in music, because very few bands now can sell out a stadium. I was listening to a podcast recently talking about the music industry, and they talk about the fragmentation of the music industry. That everyone, again, in days past, there were tons of bands that could sell out a stadium. But now if you look, who are the bands realistically that can sell out stadiums? They're old. The Rolling Stones, U2, U2's getting into their 50s now, late 50s. Who's going to be the ones that can sell out stadiums? Coldplay maybe, Kanye, maybe Jay-Z, Taylor Swift, but there's not many. You mostly have to do smaller venues because people are tribal in their music choice. There's very few meta bands that connect people like they used to. And this is part of the fragmentation of our culture. And these grand shared narratives, by the way, allow people to live in peace. Because these are things that a group of people agree on and say, you know what, these are the truths by which we choose to live. These will unite us. By the way, as Christians, we hold to these truths. And these unite us together in Christ. They help us overcome all of our differences. Does that mean that we don't have differences and we don't struggle within those? Absolutely not. But who we are in Christ, that meta-narrative helps us push past those. But postmoderns reject meta-narratives, and that's very important. That's another key one that I'll come back to time and time again. But what happens when you lose these meta-narratives? What happens? Well, you lose human nature. You reject the idea of human nature. Because that's holistic. Now people are left to define themselves. You lose ideologies. You reject an ideology. Because ideologies are things that can bond people together. There is no such thing as universalism or universal truths. Again, those are grand narratives. Everyone is left to determine who they are. You also lose social progress, or you reject the idea of social progress. And here's why. Because if we can't agree on what's good, then we can't agree on what we're aiming at. We can't agree on the goal we want to reach. You reject absolute truth. Because again, that means it applies to all people. You also reject the idea of objective notions of reason. And one of those is what some people refer to as the master's tools. It's been common in academia right now as people begin to continue to look at the idea of oppressor and oppressed, so reading everything through the grid of power plays. As everyone begins to do this, and more and more people are doing this in academia, one of the things that emerges is the idea of the master's tools. And what do I mean by that? Well, look here on the slide. It says the master's tools are things such as logic, reason, science, evidence. Exegesis could be put in there. The idea, by the way, of exegesis, when one exegetes the Bible, the Greek word ex means out of or from. So the idea is that we look at the Bible and out of it or from it, that we get truth. So these ideas of logic, reason, science, evidence, exegesis. The argument by people is that these are tools that people invented, in this case Western civilization, invented these methods of knowing to exclude other ways of knowing. In other words, it's all about a power play. It's all about, people used logic and reason and science and evidence, not because they were trying to get truth, because remember, truth doesn't exist, but because they were trying to oppress other people. By the way, this was played out at Evergreen College not in Tacoma, Washington, down in Olympia, Washington. And in Olympia, there was a professor, his name is Brett Weinstein, secular Jew, and he taught there. You can learn more about him. But Evergreen, again, is a very much a very liberal arts college. Okay, and so it's an interesting place to say the least. And one of the things that happened on campus, the students came and they were saying how Evergreen was an incredibly racist institution. And Weinstein asked, he says, well, what's your proof? What's your evidence? He goes, okay, I hear you. Give me your evidence. Tell me why you think this is the case. And the students just got furious at him. There's an uprising against him. By the way, there's a documentary on this. You can watch it. And they're like, evidence? No, that's just a master's tool. That's just something that Europeans have used to oppress other people. We just say that it's the case. And that's what matters. You can't question our truth. And if you're thinking within the idea of postmodernity, they're right. Because if this group says this is true, then another group has no way of saying, no, that's not true. So all these things, I mean, think about this. Logic, reason, evidence. If we can't use those, how can we know anything? And yet, that's very much what's going on. And these are as we look at postmodernity right now. The realities of postmodernism are this, is that therefore, as a result of these kind of things, since logic, reason, evidence, science, we can't trust these things, these are just master's tools, the more marginalized one can be, the more elevated status and subsequent power one receives. So it's the idea of victimhood, or the more oppressed one can be and shown how one is being oppressed, then actually the more in power one can become. And this results in laddering. It's a term that people talk about, where the more marginalized one is, the more power one receives. So I have a friend, works at a university, and this is how it plays out. They were having a faculty meeting, a new student union building was being built, constructed, and they were figuring out different rooms. And it was proposed, they said, oh, the faith groups on campus would like to have a prayer room. By the way, faith groups, so Christian, Muslim, Jew, what have you, and other faiths, they would like to have a prayer room. And this particular professor spoke up on the committee and was like, well, half of my students are Wiccan and they wouldn't be in favor of such a thing. I just don't think that's right. And so she was a woman, and so that gives her a little bit of a minority status, and she's speaking of Wiccans, so again, a minority religion, so to speak. What she doesn't tell you is that half of her students, so the particular courses she teaches, she has 8 students, and 4 of those are Wiccan. So it's not speaking as a large percentage. But then, interestingly enough, another voice spoke up. And this was a woman of, because I live in New Zealand, she was a woman of Maori and Pacifica descent. And so she says, well, actually, the Maori and the Pacifica greatly value spiritual things. And it would be quite helpful for our students if they had those things. And so what do we see within this? And so it was a ladder. And so she was within that, she would then say, well, yes, I too am a woman, but I'm Maori and Pacifica, so our cultures have had some oppression here in New Zealand. And so we have had to, and then that, and religion and spirituality is important to us. And so she went up to that other professor. And so my friend he said, I began to sit back and think, who could ladder her? Who could be, is it possible? And he said, well, I came to kind of the conclusion, the only person that could ladder her would be probably a female or male transgender individual of Maori or Pacifica descent. Is probably the only person. But this is the game one begins to get into, because the reality is, and postmodernity isn't honest about, it's a dishonest power play. Because it plays the power game. It reads everything through the lids of power and power exploitation, but it doesn't admit that it does the same thing. Postmodernity loves to sit here and say, play that power game, and say, and use those, because again, the more I can show, the more I can ladder, the more I can show of how oppressed one really is, the more I can actually gain power. But postmodernity doesn't admit to it. And yet, these open displays of self-righteously motivated power happens. Why? As a means to quash dissenting views. By the way, one of the ways you see this play out right now, and I don't have a slide on this, and so you'll just have to take some good notes right here, is the idea of, you might have heard the term intersectionality. It's a real buzzword right now, and a lot of people have heard the word, but they don't know how to define it. Intersectionality is, again, another form of power play. Because what it says is that, so for example, I'm just going to shoot very straight with you here. This is the way things operate. I am a male of European descent. So that basically, according to intersectionality, I basically see the world in grayscale. I can't see any color. So whenever I see events, I can only see them in grayscale. Now, if my wife were here, she is a female of European descent. So she can see one color. She can see green. Let's say that my wife was a minority, a person of color. Then she would have two colors. She could see, say, green and red. Let's continue this illustration further. If the individual is a person of color, female, who is a lesbian, then they can see three colors. If this is a person of color who is female, transgender, see three, maybe four colors. What if this is we'll go back to person of color, female, lesbian, who has a physical handicap of some sort. Maybe she has MS, or maybe she has to use a wheelchair because of some reason or another. That individual can see five colors. Person of color, female, disability, lesbian, who then is one, and see, even you kind of hear me back talking and kind of hemming and hawing a little bit, because this is a hard thing to say, but I'm just speaking factual things here, who maybe is obese. That gives her five colors that she can see. And so these are all ways in which the more intersected one can be, the higher one is, the more colors of the rainbow one can see. And so that these persons, the more intersected one is, actually the more they can see. And so now let's go back to me, bottom of the totem pole, I can only see in grayscale. I have to go to this person because this person not only can see things I can't, but I'll never be able to see things the way they are. And so that person's actually the arbitrator of truth, not me. So I have to be reliant upon that person. And so you can see where this power game, and this is the way it's playing out in academia right now, is happening. And so it's within this, and this is how it happens within postmodernity. You can see. I mean, look, the reality is we all have different backgrounds. We all bring different things to the table. But again, if the more marginalized one is, the greater one's voice can become, then that's how this individual gets to be in this perspective. And postmodernity, again, doesn't give, but that's their truth. But their truth somehow now has the ability to speak to all things. And that's where the hypocrisy begins to kick in. And I'll touch more on that here just briefly. But one of the other points to talk about is the idea of deconstruction, because that's another reality within postmodernity. And if I'm honest, deconstruction is a hard word to understand. Because deconstruction views, again, it takes the assumption viewing everything as a power play and a social construct. It denies the existence of a meta-narrative because there is no commonality between people. Remember, we spent some time on that earlier. Deconstruction also results in a lack of trust because you're skeptical about anyone who is an authority. You're skeptical about anything that is truth. And so a deconstructionist is always asking the question, what's underneath that? Why do we do this? Again, those are good questions to ask. Tell me why. Why do we do this? But within that, people can use deconstruction as a way to hustle or avoid accountability. Because it's a way to cut the legs off at a conversation. And a friend of mine experienced this in his own life as he works with this particular population, Christians who've kind of deconstructed their faith. They keep asking, why do we do this? And why do we do this? And why do we do this? And he says it does, for many of them, started as a genuine way to understand things. They had grown up within, say, a Christian youth group of some kind. They had been a part of the Christian community, but now they moved into their late teens, into their 20s and beyond. They were in the natural stage of making their faith their own. And so they began to question things and want to understand, why do things operate the way they do? Which is fine. That's actually a very natural process. But in their questioning, within it, they kept questioning. Why? But within it, he began to discern that they were questioning no longer to understand why, but because they no longer wanted to be held accountable to anything. And so he would ask them, for example, these were people that he knew, and he would be like, so hey, I mean, you talk about not feeling connected to God and not hearing Him. Have you spent any time in prayer lately? Or like, have you prayed or consulted? And they're like, what even is prayer? I mean, what is that? And he said it became apparent that was actually a way of ending the conversation. Because if I can't, and if we can have a discussion on what prayer is, it was a way to cut off the conversation to where there couldn't be any accountability or any way to move forward. And that's probably one of the realities of deconstructionism, is that it results in a loss of conviction. Because as you begin to deconstruct things and tear things apart, you don't find anything worth dying for. Again, it's good to ask why, but as you keep asking why, and why do we do this, and why do we do this, it's like you tear the whole house apart. And which I'll get to in just a minute, but you're going to see this photo I have on there, this bird. And this is called the Kia bird. The Kia bird and you're going to see, what is that Kia bird doing? It's got a piece of rubber in its mouth, and it's pulling it off the car. Well, the Kia bird is an alpine parrot in New Zealand. It's a really cheeky bird, okay, as Kiwis say, okay? It's very mischievous. And it loves to take this beak. It's very curious, and it goes up, and it takes its beak, and it loves to pull up the rubber around the windshield, or as the Kiwis say, the windscreen. It'll take its beak, and it'll put it into the crevices of tires. It's been known to pop tires. They love to fly off with your shoes. We were hiking somewhere, and that's why you got to tie, if you know there's Kias, you have to tie your shoes or your boots together so it's too heavy so they don't fly off with. My youngest son's shoes were so light that a Kia bird actually flew off with his shoes. He woke up in the morning and thankfully someone found him in the bushes. But Kia birds are very curious. They love to tear things up. But as my friend says, he goes, you never see a Kia that's actually put something together. You've only seen Kias that take things apart. And that's what deconstructionists do. Because the reality is, as you look at deconstruction and you keep asking these questions, is that you don't have to stand for anything because everything's theoretical. You're always asking questions. Deconstructionism also allows you to protect your ideas from being tested. Because you can say, well, it's just really complicated. I'm still figuring things out. And a lot of times, that just leads to inaction. You just stay where you are. One of the hard things about postmodernity is it's hard to hope because so many things have let you down. Or, again, postmodernity says hope just isn't real. Things are only going to get worse. And so as a result, in deconstruction, it's scary to hope. And so it's easier to remain in skepticism because hope is costly, because you might get let down. Being a skeptic also means you never have to face defeat, and you never have to be let down. So if you're always the constant skeptic, you're actually protecting yourself from maybe things that go bad. And you don't have to belong to anyone, because to belong means you have to compromise. And this is one of the realities of deconstructionists, as we see of postmoderns, is that everyone has their own tribe, and they don't want to compromise, ironically. Because again, to compromise means that we're going to work together, we're going to find some meta-narrative that's going to unite us. And we see this, for example, Christians who deconstruct their faith. They begin to deny the existence of a meta-narrative or a grand story, and thus they eliminate God's message. They deconstruct on many levels because their lack of trust leads them to a further lack of trust in anything. And so they keep pulling things apart. They're hesitant to trust because they don't want to be let down. And this results in pulling away from Christian practices in general. And so what becomes, again, this very natural stage of someone making their faith their own and asking questions, again, this is good, but it begins to spin out of control because there is no truth. There's not a belief or willingness to allow answers to those questions. And it becomes a slow and steady decline, if not spiritual death in the end. And it'd be easy to think like, man, this is bad. But it makes me think of something one of my professors said. He says, you actually live in a great time. He says, because can you imagine ministering from the 1700s on for 200 plus years of people saying, things are going to get better. The future's only going to be great. And to realize like, now, I don't think you have to work very hard for people to see like, hey, things aren't that good. There's unrest. You don't have to work hard to convince things that things are a little off. And so as a result, people are looking for answers. So what can be offered? Well, to begin with, a meta-narrative rooted in history that connects all people. And this is Jesus. This is the Word made flesh. Because in Jesus, Jesus gives us meaning and purpose. It is a meta-narrative. So the reality is instead of denying one, we have to further emphasize, no, there is a meta-narrative. There is something that connects us all. We need to be connected. We are all made in the image of God, each one of us. And because we're made in the image of God, every person has value, regardless of their work, their socioeconomic background, their culture, whatever may have you, male, female, everyone. Remember, this is the words of Paul. There is no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We are all one in Christ. I think as well, there has to be a commitment to the truth, even at the cost of being ostracized. Because the reality is, I think we need to recognize there are going to be people, and they've always existed, who will never listen. There's never going to be enough. You can't win them all. Instead, look for those people of peace. Jesus talks about this in Luke. When you go into a village, look for the people of peace. Look for the people who will welcome you in your home. Look for the people who are willing to listen. Get to know people. Truth salted with grace and understanding. Go in and have truth, but have it salted with grace and understanding. Be a learner. Listen to people. Ask questions, but also speak into it. People are looking for other people with conviction. There's a fascinating article that came out earlier this year about a British man who was a product of academia in the UK. And as he looked at academia and it's all of its fights over everything's a social construct and everything is used to, exploit somebody else, he just began to look at that and said, you know what? Everything can't, he just began to reject the idea that everything was a power play. And he looked at all the chaos on that side of academia and he said, there's got to be another way. And so what he went and did is he said, then he went over to the conservatives. And basically it was just like, make a lot of money, get drunk, buy a lot of stuff. And he's like, well, that's empty too. By the way, that's Ayn Rand, all right? And that's a whole nother talk for another day. But he looked at that and he says, that's empty. So then he went to the church, and he went to the Church of England. But he said all he found was in the Church of England, mainline denominational church he goes, it was all just, there was no heart in it. There was no passion. Jesus was simply a good idea. Sin was maybe something you had. And he's like, I just didn't find anything there. There was no substance. There was no conviction. And he found his conviction and he found his substance, interestingly enough, in Islam. And he became a Muslim. He's like, these people have passion. These people have conviction. Now look, I'm not saying Islam is the answer. Of course not. But what is it that he found within it? He found conviction and passion and people that were wanting to do something about the world. That's what Jesus wants. Jesus wants us to be people of conviction, people of passion, people who are looking to impact the world. So instead of, we got to be maybe a little bit quieter and we've got to, dial down who we are because we don't want people to be... No! People are looking for people of conviction. Those are the people, we need to find the people of peace. And there also are cures to deconstructionism. I'm going to give you a few in just a minute. One of these is to ask people, my friend was people who are in deconstruction, they just don't, it leads to depression a lot of times because they don't feel there's anything worth living for. And so that's one of the things he asked me, he goes, is there something you would die for? What would you die for? Would you die to help, change sex trafficking? Would you die for the social welfare system? Would you die for, fill in the blank? What is something you would die for? He goes, because if you got something you would die for, there's like a sliver, a little bit of conviction in there, and that can grow and burgeon. And he encourages people to question things. Again, it is great to question things, but to put brakes on there. To recognize, hey, you know what? What are some ways in which you can keep your questions from going too far? And within that, we see that reconstruction is possible. Got a few things here to begin with. Reconstruction is to start naming the babies that were thrown out with the bathwater and looking and saying, well, what needs to be brought back in? What needs to be seen? As well, no more armchair critiquing. Instead, leaning into some of the ideas that one believes in. That's one way to deal with deconstruction, is to sit there. And his friend said he hears people say, they're all about, for instance, social justice and helping the poor. And he says, that's great. He goes, so why don't you give me a couple of the names of some of the poor people you hang out with and that you're trying to help. And he says, sadly, a fair amount of time, they don't have someone. They don't have a name or two. And so he says, go get a name. Go get someone. Get involved. Because guess what? When you go and you get involved and you see, ooh, this is messy. This is hard. And you start having skin in the game. Also, you have to make peace. A deconstructionist has to learn to make peace with compromise. Because the reality is we need each other. We need that meta-narrative. And learn to compromise. And afford to belong to something. To not stay a rampant individual. Again, rampant individualism is one of our real problems right now. It's one of the things that has led people to being in the condition that they are. We need to be a part of a greater group. And to be a part of a greater group means some compromise. We can't just armchair critique. We've got to be a part. And to begin to accept and have grace for those who are learning what you had to learn. And so within that, the people who are asking a bunch of questions, having grace with them and walking with them in that process, but also reminding them, saying, hey, guess what? You know, someday you're going to run across people who are asking all these questions too, and you're going to have to have grace with them. So being patient with people in the process and realizing that people are figuring stuff out. But again, going back to that passion and that commitment, letting people see what that is, getting into regular rhythms with God. That's one thing again, time in community, prayer, fellowship with other believers, time in the Word of God, time in listening and being in the presence of God. These are things, if we go back to these truths, the things that Jesus talked about, these are ways of combating this. Because part of being part of the community of God is finding that meta-narrative and drawing people back to that meta-narrative we have in Jesus. Now I know there's more that could be said about postmodernity. There's more solutions that could be offered. You know, in some ways I'll probably later feel a little bit embarrassed by some of the things I said today, or like, oh man, I got that wrong. You know what? Hopefully this will be helpful for you. Hopefully this will provide some answers. Because the reality is, this is the air we breathe. This is the water we swim in. And hopefully today might have provided some clarity for you about postmodernity. And if there are questions you have, feel free to email me at the Biblical Studies program. Be happy to maybe push you onto some resources or interact with you or answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and look forward to seeing you in either one of our courses or maybe another one of the shorts we offer. Take care and hope you're well.